Thanks for that introduction. And as I look over the slide, I realize some sort of font issue exists. Hopefully they look okay. When I started thinking about what am I going to talk about today, I put together about 30 slides, and then I looked at the agenda and saw I only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to go fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through all 30 slides. I did cut it down. But I think a lot of you came to this summit because you have questions. They may be varying degrees of questions. Some of them may be on the screen. Many are probably not on the screen. Because I know this is a regulated industry that is probably similar to some of the things we heard in the telecommunications industry, I also added one more special question for you, which is how can I incorporate open source into a public procurement process? Unfortunately, the fonts are pushing some of the words off the screen, but this is one of the common questions we've heard from a number of transmission systems operators, distribution system operators, public utilities in the US and elsewhere, is around, we have to go through a different process, we're a little bit different. I can assure you that other industries are regulated as well, maybe in different ways, but they've gone through this process before. The good thing about open source is that you'll find a lot of people are willing to share how they went through and did this. And because they're willing to share and they're willing to come to today and speak to you about what they did in their industry or in their organization, we see things like this. Thanks to RTE and I know 3, we have a guide available online. This is on the LF Energy website right now. And you can go to the resources page and go under the open source guides, and it'll be the first one at the top. But there is a guide showing the benefits of open source, but practical guide for how to require open source in public contracts. And this is just documentation. It's under a CC BY license. Feel free to download it to share it. Attribute the source to RTE and I03, but thanks to them for making this available. And this is just one example of the way that our communities operate outside of just sharing code, but helping with best practices, guides, implementations, and things like that. Oh, you're going to swap me out? Okay, so I'm going to talk next about, why does this all work? There's sort of an underlying process or motivation that makes open source successful. When you look across software, Mark Andreessen had coined the phrase, software is eating the world. And then a few years later, everybody realized, no, it's actually open source software is eating software. And the reality is that probably 70 to 90% of any software code stack, if you look at the stack of what's in a system, 70 to 90% of that software is actually open source software. The analysts differ in how they measure it, but roughly 70 to 90%. All I need to know from 70 to 90% is that's a pretty significant percentage of any stack of software. And the question becomes, well, why are people doing this? It's like you're giving away software for free, using software for free. Shouldn't they be paying somebody for that? Well, the reality is there's a number of different motivations. A lot of it's generally because it's infrastructure software. It's something that nobody's paying you for value. It's something that requires interoperability. It requires the ability of other people to depend on that software being there in order to build something higher value on top. There's a number of different reasons for this. But then people contribute back. And so number one questions I get from a number of industries when we talk to them is, well, why do people contribute back? If I'm an end user of software, I've learned at some point how to consume open source. I acquired or paid for a subscription to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But why would I ever want to contribute back? And this comes down to once you start to take a dependency on some of this software that's specific to your needs, you're going to have to make changes. You're going to make customizations to it. At some point, you're going to have a new feature that you need to add. And Nithya hinted at this in sort of her arc of the maturity model of engagement with open source. But the reality is at some point, your engineering teams will figure out that maintaining those features, fixes, those little special things that you added into it, out of band from the open source project, will end up costing you far more engineering dollars in the long run to keep it yourself. And the reason is that maintaining the upstream source and syncing it with your patches every single time there's a new release, or every single time there's a new architectural change or a new security fix or something that comes out, will become far more expensive than the value you're getting from keeping that to yourself. And so companies contribute it back upstream. They don't do it just out of social good, some do, But many companies look at it as a cost equation. It's more expensive for us to maintain this software without contributing it upstream. And now that I used about 2 minutes of my 10 on that point, I thought that was a really important one to make because that underlies a lot of what the engine is supporting this model of open source, where you'll have some sort of community development process. Organizations will build products or solutions, or they're implemented into systems or services that they're making available. And then you get to the bug fixes and the security updates. And that's where a lot of that friction of maintaining the open source software and out-of-band fixes comes up, because there are security updates that are going to be more important than anything else. And so you need to be able to swim upstream very quickly and sink upstream very rapidly. And that's what drives a lot of this cycle. I will point out that what is the role of the Linux Foundation in all of this? Our role is really, some people call it Switzerland of open source, but we put a neutral project governance and IP model in place in the middle of this. It gives us a framework for people to come together, to collaborate, to meet together, to work together under a set of policies and infrastructure that enable this to work. And so that's really where we sit, is in the middle. In terms of governance, I'll summarize this very quickly. Our basic form of governance is to make sure whatever you're doing is written down, so that somebody who's new to the project, or when an issue comes up, that the way that you make decisions and who makes decisions is documented so that people know how decisions are going to be made. Trademarks, we neutrally own those at the foundation level. Why? Well, the reason is because if some other company, maybe a competitor, owns the right to that trademark, some other organization won't be as inclined to participate in that project. So we try to reduce the barriers to participation from the intellectual property side. We like to make sure that the licensing is documented, that it's very clear what the licensing is. Ideally, things like SPDX headers, which we may not have talked about before, but there's a short notification tag. It looks like an XML notation. And it says SPDX license identifier : and then you have one of a list of 200 some open source licenses that have been identified by the SPDX group. SPDX itself is an open source community. And they put together a list of all the main open source licenses, and it has a legal group of lawyers who work together. And that list has become the canonical way that most organizations are now documenting what the license is for any file in open source. And all these things are important because it puts together a way to reduce the friction for you to adopt, use, contribute back, and leverage open source software. People ask all the time, well, what does it take to host a project at the Linux Foundation? It's pretty simple. We've set up this neutral place so that people can work together. And what we're generally looking for is, what projects do organizations want to work on together? And in that vein, we like to make sure that there is a documented, transparent governance model. We have a number of templates and open source best practices. We don't take over your project. We don't kick off all the committers or maintainers of your project day one. What we do is we put in place a process to enable others to engage and get involved in the project so that at some point you want to make them a committer or help them engage. First and foremost is make sure that project is getting a release out, that it's stable, that bugs are being fixed, that security issues are being addressed. Any trademark, Git repo accounts, any of sort of the core assets of the community are generally owned by the foundation. Again, just to make sure that's neutral. The project needs to operate under an open source license and IP model. Open source licenses are generally identified by the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, and then also the Free Software Foundation has a list of what they consider free and libre open licenses. And then finally, the Linux Foundation, we're sort of the intersection of this open collaborative model. There's like 95 or 98 million projects on GitHub, and then industry. And so our intersection is really to make sure that there's at least some organization out there who sponsors and supports this project being something at the Linux Foundation. So we do require the sponsorship of a Linux Foundation member. And all of this produces a lot of open source projects. We have over 225 projects now at the Linux Foundation. That means that we have, and we also have about 1,300 members across our different projects and entities. And when we add up all of the developers that are engaged in our projects, it's somewhere north of, I think, 40,000 developers now. And with all of this activity going on, there's a lot of changes, a lot of things going on, new releases every single day. And what happens is that a lot of organizations go through a lot of the same issues you're all going to run into. If you haven't hit them yet, there's going to be a number of questions you're going to have within your organization about how do I use, contribute, leverage open source, how do I manage it at a policy level internally. All these questions, other people have gone before and answered them. And they've actually worked together. We have a community called the To-Do Group, which is a group of experts who have been through a lot of these issues before. They're program office managers at various organizations. And what they did is they came together and they worked on a set of guides for the future program office managers. And what these guides are intended to do is to help share the knowledge downstream. And these groups came together. There were multiple authors for every single document. I put a list of the current documents that are out there on the slide, but there's others being created all the time. And when a different set of program office managers get together and they say there's this other new issue, we should work on a guide together, this is what they do. And they publish all of this publicly. It's out on GitHub. The source for these documents is out on GitHub. You can help make contributions and changes to it yourself if you'd like to. And then, when you look at what's been going on, a number of organizations even shared, here's how we did it in our organization. Not just how do you do it generically, but here's what we went through in our company, which is a very strong lesson learned sort of way to go through a description of how this all works. Because each of these companies has different cultures, they have different markets that they're operating in, they have different business models, and it's likely that one of these at least will line up to something that you're dealing with. And we have many other organizations who have been through this process who aren't on this list. They didn't necessarily write a guide for it, but we'd be happy to put you in touch with them and help make a connection so you can understand how others did it. We have a number of organizations who often talk about topics like functional safety requirements and how you do functional safety certification with open source, or how do you deal with regulations like in banking or in telecommunications. There's a number of different things that go on in various types of industries. And the last point I'll make is that we brought a number of people here from around the world, in particular because they're experts in what they do. I would highly recommend that you leverage this opportunity. One of the early things I recall doing with RTE is we met in San Francisco. We did a learning tour, right? And we brought in a whole bunch of people and you guys just asked questions after question after question. It was great. I think RTE had the benefit of getting a very quick lesson and knowledge build out from that activity. Here we have a set of experts as well, and I encourage you all to ask them questions and dive deeper and deeper and deeper and get down into the nitty-gritty details of some of the particular issues you're dealing with. We can talk generically and high level all day, but until we actually know what your particular concern is, it's really hard to just magically come up with the answer. So leverage these next 2 days to learn, ask questions, and see how we can work together better. And that's the end of my talk. So stay to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mike.
A little over 10.
A question, two, or everybody's in the, yes.
Yep.
Maybe you can just try like this. You talked about yeah, you described how hard it is to keep up synchronizing upstream. And I was wondering, do we even need strong copyleft licenses like GPL if this process, if it's always like this for all the companies? Because in my institute you always have these discussions, should we do it, should we use GPL or BSD license? And yeah.
I get this question quite often. We're not, we don't recommend any particular license usually just because we serve many different constituencies who have different views. Beyond just, sort of the IP and intellectual property policies and structures, we have some communities like the Linux kernel, for example, which was born out of a particular social movement that had, more of an interest in making sure that there was, parameters put in place to define the future of that software roadmap. The reality is that most of our projects today use an Apache 2 license. It is wildly successful. It's probably, more contributions coming in under Apache 2 every single day than any other particular license. And Denise, a part of the Apache Software Foundation, is cheering in the back. But the Apache license is more of a permissive model. It's not a copyleft license. The reality is that because of all these change requirements and the fact that it's too expensive for you to not contribute back upstream, most organizations are doing it anyway. So they're really, these modern days, I really don't see in the industry uses a reason to put in a license that you have to contribute back on some sort of obscure condition. Instead, I think most organizations are comfortable, and we've seen a lot of successful implementations of projects that are based on a more permissive model. It's not that it's for everything. We have certainly projects under the MPL v2, EPL v2, or the Eclipse Public License. We have projects under like Node.js. I'm sure every one of your organizations are using Node.js somewhere. It is, MIT licensed, and so it's also one of the most widely engaging projects. It has one of the largest developer communities around. Denise was involved in that as well. So, the reality is, we haven't seen a need to put it into the license in more recent times, if that answers your question. Thank you. Yes? Hang on, there's a microphone coming just so others can hear.
Oh, sorry. In the last organization I worked for, there are a number of enterprise customers who wanted specifically to exclude GPL licensing. So is it likely that you would recommend, if you expect enterprises to use your open source project to build their own IP, that perhaps something a little more permissive is advisable?
So I can't give you legal advice, but I'll tell you generically what we see in the industry. We've seen a number of organizations go down that path of thou shalt not use license X, GPL, whatever. The reality is that my first question is, for what? And they'll say, oh, we're doing some sort of, application that does orchestration, blah, blah, blah. And it's really important, and we want to make sure that, it's something that we can have a value. And I say, okay, well, how are you packaging this? How are you using it? Well, if we're putting it into a container and we're using a Debian base. Well, how do you do that without using the GPL v2? The reality is that most software these days is either running on Windows or on Linux. Linux is based on GPL v2. So somewhere in the stack, you're likely to have GPL software. Is it really going to ruin your business model? Probably not, because you have to look at where you're using it and why you're using it. And so the reality is that most stacks today will have many licenses. I can't think of a single pure stack of one open source license out there. Perhaps if you took like a Zephyr RTOS with like a small Apache project and put it on a sensor, you could get to an entirely Apache stack, but that would be really hard to do, I think, in a general purpose context. So today we don't see that as so much an issue, because people have put more time into understanding the GPL license, for example, and understanding where its boundaries are. Because the GPL doesn't say all your software has to be made available under this license. It says certain things have to be available under this license, and only upon certain conditions. And so helping the attorneys understand exactly what the GPL v2 or v3 license says generally gets them over the issues that they're concerned about, that they're knee-jerk reacting by saying, thou shalt not use X license. And so from that perspective, you're all using the GPL v2 license. Trust me, you are. It's just a matter of where and how you're using it, and making sure that you're compliant with the license, and that generally is not an issue. In fact, we have a number of industry players who went from being in that camp to then actually prescribing or creating GPL projects themselves. There's a particular bank I have in mind who did that. And so I can assure you that once you look into it, it generally makes sense in terms of how this all works. But we get this question all of the time, so thanks for asking. Any other questions?
One more?
Okay.
Okay.
Just one notice, I'm only here today and tonight, So if you do want to ask me a question offside, because it's a little bit more sensitive, I'm happy to have a conversation offline in the room, outside the room, at the conference event, or whatever. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike.